This program is called The Voice of Value. So one question we always love to ask is, when you look at the arc of your life, where and how did you find your unique voice and value? What was that moment and what did it look like?
Yeah, when you have an Army career, you can normally measure it by how you're interacting with the people you're working with. I remember when I was a young officer, I would have interaction with my platoon, and I was quite a micromanager, and we'd do something well, and we were an effective team, and I would say, that's my great value. I'm good at this business, or I'm competent at this business. About the time I was a battalion commander, or reaching that, which is just short of 20 years in service, 17, 18 years in service, you have about 600 people you command. Suddenly, you're called behind your back, the old man. I'm all of 38.
Right, the old man.
But you're now shaping people's lives. You're now at a point senior enough where you're shaping young soldiers, young officers' lives. You're setting them in a direction. You're starting to be the person they talk about. I remember once the little Fort Bragg newspaper used to do these questions with people, soldiers, around the post. And they asked somebody, what's your most memorable moment? And a soldier was in that paper quoted, having lunch with my battalion commander, Colonel McChrystal. And I went, what? And then you suddenly realize, whoa, everything you do when you're at a certain level matters. I started to see my value differently. I started to see my value as not my competence as an operator. It's not my ability to do certain things. My value was through them or to them. How could I not just make him feel good? How could I make him a better soldier? How, if and when we went to combat, is he more likely to survive than he might otherwise be? And you start to take this indirect value from the performance of others. You start to, when you see an organization do well that you have worked with, you just take this real deep, quiet satisfaction when you see a young person that had grown up under you get promoted. I remember when I got very senior, I'd have sergeants major in the Army who I'd served with when they were privates. And it had been Captain McChrystal and Private so-and-so, or, and now they're sergeants major. And I didn't do it, they did it. But vicariously, I took this extraordinary sense of maybe they wouldn't have made it if they hadn't worked with me for a period. Maybe.
We can make decisions and they can suffer tremendous variability. Literally 5 feet outside of this conference room, you and I could set a strategy or outcomes, and the meaning of that and the signal strength of that cascading through the organization can be highly variable. I wonder, for somebody who's led at scale, what communication tools or approaches have you seen that ensure the alignment of the outcome and the execution of the outcome without that variability?
That's great, Chad. And with the arrival of information technology, you have some aids now that were harder to do than in the past. Somebody way out on the edge of your organization, where in the old days you couldn't get much information to them, nor could anybody else. Nowadays, if you're not communicating with them, they're communicating with others, they're getting counter things. So the reality is you've got to compete for that person's understanding and their attention. So I think the first thing you have to do is make sure you understand what message you want to send. And this is key, because we can send conflicting messages. We can say, this is the priorities of the organization. Then we do some slightly different things. These may really be our priorities. These may be things we're doing for a limited period. But if you don't explain that to people, they will see what they see and they will derive conclusions. So figure out what you want to communicate. We tend to do this outside the company. We're going to brand ourselves. This is what we want customers to see. You've got to start with what you want your people to think, to know. The second is you've got to keep the message simple. When I was a regimental commander, my sergeant major and I, about 2,200 guys then, my sergeant major and I decided we were going to have 4 priorities. And for 2 years in command, that's what I talked about 99% of the time. I'd go places and they'd bring up X and I'd go, let me tell you about 1, 2, 3, 4. Then maybe a year into it, people started saying, sir, we got 4 priorities. But I had said it hundreds and hundreds of times. And I know that if I go in on Monday and I say, here are our 4 priorities, And then I go in Tuesday and I say, this is what's important, and it's different. Many people will dump what you said on Monday because they got changed. It's when they hear the same thing over and over in different words from different angles that suddenly they go, wow, you're serious about that. And so it's repetitive. Can be frustrating for leaders. But the reality is, over time, if you're hammering the same thing over and over, it's remarkably the most effective thing you can do.
Trust is critical to leaders. I want to go back to Iraq, where General McChrystal has a breakfast meeting, 90 minutes, 7,000 people in a teleconference, and really, I think, practice radical transparency. I could be caller 5,433 on that call and could have done anything with that information. But you led from a position of transparency will engender trust. We have leaders today in sales that are hedging on, should I show the roadmap? Should I talk about the implementation and all the complexities to it? We're under indexing on an outcome. Maybe we don't share that. Help them understand the bravery of going to radical transparency and how that engenders trust and why that's the right course.
Yeah, it's the things we worried about in our radical transparency started with security. It was top secret information, and so 7,500 people, anybody could leak it and go out, and we just didn't have the problem. Then there was the cultural thing that almost applies to sales. Each of our subordinate units, they had an ego and they had interests, and they wanted to be more successful than anybody else. There was an internal competition. There was also just this cultural aversion to sharing information with somebody who's not the same as you. Delta Force to the SEALs, right? You just don't. And then there was just a procedural habit of not doing it. Nobody ever got in trouble before that for not sharing information with someone. But if you shared information with someone else, you could be called on the carpet. Might not be, but you might be. So the safe thing is not to. And you just say, well, I didn't have time. I didn't think, whatever. So you have to start to incentivize sharing. You have to make people think that that's better than not. When we went to this radical transparency, we had to start with showing it at my headquarters. We had to be very, very open with all of our partners from the intelligence community, state. We had to share everything with them. And it took quite a while before we got anything close to reciprocity from that. But they were kind of holding their cards, and they said, I love seeing your cards, bro. I think I'll hold mine. So you had to do that, and then you had to tell people sharing information has a bit of risk, but at the end of the day, not sharing is far riskier. And the old fallacy of, the need to know thing, the fallacy is who knows who needs to know. And so you may not share information with me because you think I don't need to know, but I'm in fact doing something you're unaware of that I absolutely need that information. And so what we did was we leaned very hard the other way. There were certain things we didn't share, but we found that transparency in almost every case had more value than the downside. And when you do have problems emanating from it, you have to put those in context, understanding what the likely muscle reaction will be if you go, that's dangerous. Everybody will lock up and not share.
In this environment where you have this leadership ecosystem that's constantly adjusting and adapting to new information, it strikes me that the learning how to learn becomes so critical, and yet it's not taught. And there's very little discussed on this. How do we help the learning how to learn process with a leader?
Yeah, that's really good. And it's not just the individual. The leader has got to create an environment where information gets to them. And a lot of that's got to be pull. The leader can't wait for people to tell him, hey, boss, you need to know this. Because there's institution, particularly in a hierarchical thing like the military. So you've got to be curious enough to say, I need somebody to come tell me about that. Or in a big open thing, you need to ask that question because a lot of other people don't understand it. That's you personally, but that's only a tiny part of the problem because you learning is of value. The organization has to learn. So the first thing that happens is assume that you're learning all these lessons across your distributed organization, but you don't want everybody to have to learn everyone through experience because it's just too painful, too slow, too expensive. So what we did was, by linking everybody on that big video teleconference every day, we tried to push the learnings across so that everybody's hearing this stuff. Now, not everybody was smart enough to grab it and learn, But it's amazing how fast people will. Don't touch the stove because it's hot, and the word gets out. But it's got to be in the culture. We used to do a thing about every 2 or 3 weeks. Every one of our subordinate task forces on a rotational basis had to brief what's happening in their sector in detail. And we had them brief 2 operations. They gave a summary of what was happening, and then they briefed 2 operations. One, they had to brief one they screwed up completely. And they would tell you the story, and sometimes it was laughable, sometimes it was not. But then they got to brief a second mission where they succeeded a lot. The reason we didn't do just the failure, because you don't want people to only brief the failure to anybody.
Right.
You let them follow that with, hey, we're not stupid. Let me show you something that worked well. I think it got people to be more candid about the failures.
Because they had the success.
They knew they were then going to go, but look how good we are. And they almost would revel in sometimes the humor and whatnot of, can you believe we did this?
With this new reframing in your book of leadership, which rightfully puts leadership in a larger context around relationships, leader-follower, or leader-partner, meaning and context. I wonder if there's a little bit of an unintended negative consequence of personal accountability. If I'm no longer the leader in the spotlight, I think of kind of Harry Truman, the buck stops here. Do we also kind of blur the lines on who's accountable?
Yeah, it is a risk that we've got to think about. And I'm not sure we're completely finished on that journey to get there, because if the network is doing something and the network's going to get credit, that's sort of fine. Everybody feels good. If the network fails, who do you choke? You're in the middle of in the mid-level of an organization. Before you control the information that went up through you and the information that went down, you made decisions and whatnot. Now suddenly everybody's getting information at the same time, and they've got freedom to act. What happens when they fail? Do you still bear responsibility? Where we came out in our experience was you do. But it's sort of a different level of responsibility. We don't come down and beat you on the head because something didn't happen that you didn't make the decision on that night. We hold you responsible for the ecosystem you're responsible for. Is it healthy? What's happening in there? Are they learning? There were a fair number of failures. We failed about 30% of the time on operations. And you say, well, when we were doing 4 a month, that's not that big a deal. When you're doing 300 a month, 30% suddenly is a lot of failures. And you're transparent, you're briefing them. And there were days you felt like, holy smoke, did we hit the ball once? And so you've got to put those into wider context. Everything has got to be contextualized so that if you get up and strike out 3 times in a row, and I'm just disgusted with you, someone needs to remind me that you're hitting 320 for the season.
Right.
And you had a bad day,
Right.
And leaders have got to respond accordingly.
Right.
Similarly, if you go hit 2 home runs, someone should tap me and say, geez, he's hitting 120.
When we are pioneering new efforts, initiatives, transforming, invariably there's going to be higher failure rates because we're learning new muscle memory, we're doing new skills and competencies. How does the organization have the stamina to continue when the early indicators are not success?
I think you've got to constantly reiterate the big picture, what you're doing, and constantly accept the failures. Now, the problem is, if you go too long, if your plan is failing and you are just bullheaded and can't figure it out, that's another issue. But more, it's a case of you're trying to push people to do something different, and you're going to get a pretty significant failure rate. You tell people to try new things, innovate, and whatnot. You've got to own that. You've got to have a way where you communicate to people to do that. When they do it and they fail, you've got to openly communicate, okay, got it, that's good. You don't have to say, well, that's great that you failed. What you have to say, that's great that you tried. What are you going to do next? Which is a signal to everybody else, because it's not the person who failed that's the audience. It's everybody else who hasn't had the courage yet to try to do something. And if you look at it and you go, Chad, that was screwed up, you're fired, nobody else is going to do anything. So you got to own it. Now, then people come back and say, well, what happens if Chad tries 12 times and fails every time? That's a different issue. That's an issue of capability or attitude. You take that offline and you deal with it. You have to deal with it, though, because if you're in an organization and you've got a bunch of people trying hard to do it, and some people failing a lot, people will start to believe that you don't really care about outcome. And they will notice. You think, well, nobody noticed that Stan keeps failing. I'm the boss. I'm the only person. Everybody notices. And I was too slow to fire people in the first years of command. And it's not, you don't fire them because you don't like them. They're good, courageous people, but they just may not be up to the task. And it was funny when I finally would fire somebody, I thought that the command would hate me because that's old Joe and everybody knows him. In reality, they all go, what took you so long? You know, if we're trying to be as effective as you say we are, we have got to uphold standards.
With leadership being so situational to events, people, and meaning, are there some consistencies, though, Stan? Are there some overarching attributes like adaptability that are constantly there regardless of the situational nuances that a leader should have?
Yeah, I think there are, but I'd be honest enough to tell you, I don't think I could give you a list that I'm completely confident of. I think the first is if you have a certain amount of courage to make decisions, we could say courage, decisiveness. The leader's got to do things, got to make things happen. I think the ability to have, or the necessity of having empathy, and that is being able to get on the other side of the table and see how your enemy or your followers see something. Because it's hard to influence people to do or not do something unless you understand how they process the information. And once you do, it's remarkably easier to do that. Some people do it intuitively. Some of us have to think real hard about how to do that. It would be nice for me to tell you that integrity and things like that, good values, are really key to that. But there are things we want more than we demand. In reality, I would like it if you were honest. I would like it if you are thoughtful. I would like it if you're compassionate. We will put up with a lot of things from leaders if we get other certain emotional things that we want. And so we need to make sure that we don't list leadership traits as being good values, you know, what you want your son or daughter to be. You can want that, but don't confuse that with what's going to make someone an effective leader. You know, look at the people who are not good people in many ways, and yet were very effective leaders, and go back to Adolf Hitler, somebody like that, is able to stimulate action in a whole population, even though he didn't have the vast majority of those admirable traits.
From a man who lived very close to the boyhood residence of Lee, went to Washington and Lee, went through West Point, where the near-perfect cadet Lee was memorialized. Tell me about the day Annie comes to you and says, Stan, I think you should take that portrait of Robert E. Lee off the wall.
Yeah. It was pretty soon after Charlottesville in 2017. And we'd both been really disgusted by what we see. My family was from the South, and so I had a lot of feelings about that. And Annie came to me and said, I think you should take the Lee picture and get rid of it. And she had given it to me 40 years before. I had it in our quarters in house. I was a second lieutenant when she took $25, which we didn't have a lot of money, and bought it for me. And I treasured it. And I was proud when in the house when I saw it, because I said, that's my hero. If I could be anything like him, that would be great. And I was proud when people came to the house and saw it, because they saw who my hero is, and they go, well, Stan's trying to be somebody that's admirable. So I resisted her. It took about a month of back and forth conversations, and I said, he wasn't political. She says, doesn't matter. People equate his image now with something that you don't support, white supremacy. I go, well, that's true. That's their problem. She says, no, it's our problem, because if someone comes in our home, they're not going to ask you about it. They're not going to say, I see the picture of Lee. Stan, are you a white supremacist? They're not going to say that. But they may walk out just thinking, Stan is subtly sending a message of something. And, you know, after about a month, I thought about it. I concluded she was right. So on a Sunday morning, I went into my little office and I took it down and took it out to the trash and threw it away. And it was not an unemotional moment for me, because I felt disloyal. I felt also weak, because I said, I'm doing this just because the headlines about Charlottesville came out. If I was really a strong person, if I believed him when I'm 20 and when I was 40, now that I'm 63, I shouldn't waver in the wind. But you know, we all need to grow. And what I realized was as I studied him more, as I thought about it more, as I processed things more, I wasn't doing it because it was popular in the moment. I was doing it because I had been pulled along to a conclusion that I just never thought about before. I'd never thought about Lee in the context of being a traitor to his nation. At West Point, they don't talk about that. They have paintings of him, and I lived in Lee Barracks. He was just a person worthy of emulation. And yet, when we studied him for the book, the profile, it took a year to write that profile because I wanted to get it just right in how I felt about it. Because I still admire so much about Robert E. Lee. There's so much about him I would like to be. But when he had the most important decision of his life in the spring of 1861, he got it wrong. I mean, he got it dead wrong.
The moral issue of the 19th century, he's on the wrong side.
And he had plenty of time to think about it. I can't forgive him for that, but it's not me to forgive him. It's more important for me to understand, guess what? Lee isn't perfect. He's not a statue. He's not a painting. He's a man. He makes mistakes. He's like me. I make mistakes. He's like all of us. We have flaws. And so he went from being this mythological depiction to being a human being. And in many ways, that's a lot healthier way to look at leaders. Because if we think of them as on the pedestal and perfect, we're invariably going to be wrong and often disappointed by it.
Say you and I that time travel is possible, Stan. Suspension of disbelief for a moment. And Chad takes Stan in a time machine. And I'm going to punch in the coordinates of 1972. And I'm going to take you to West Point. And I'm going to have you sit down with a young cadet McChrystal. Yeah. What leadership lessons would you impart to him?
Yeah, I think it's take the long view. When you start on a military career, you want to become competent right away in what you do, weapons and tactics and whatnot. I remember my father told me before I went to West Point, I asked him, actually I was at West Point when I asked him, I said, what advice would you give me? He was about to retire as a major general. And I said, if you could do it all over again, what would you do? And he said, I wouldn't work so hard. And I said, it's easy for you to say, you made it, you know. He said, no. He says, making it's not that hard. Being successful with money or rank is not as hard as you think. But the other things in life, when I say take the long view, it's the relationships you build. The only things I really regret in life, people ask me if I regret a lot of military things, not very little. But I do regret the things I didn't do. I regret the weddings I didn't go to. I regret the family reunions I missed. All of which seemed important at the time, and I was convincing myself I'm doing the right thing, it's selfless. Actually, it was stupid, and it wasn't selfless. And so if you take the long view and you say, there's a good chance I will live to be 64. When you're a 25-year-old soldier, you think, well, maybe I won't. But if someone said, you're going to live to be 64, and at that point in your life, you're going to want to be very comfortable with how you view what you did. You're going to want to feel that you did the right thing as best you could. You're going to want to have a set of relationships that make life rich. You're going to want to have a lot of people out there who say, I served with McChrystal and I got no complaints. That's the long view. And if you think about that, and that's sort of the mirror that you look into every night, I think it works.
What a great message. Take the long view. General McChrystal, a complete privilege to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Chad, it's my honor. Thank you.